So this particular final part of the topic of trading pieces, basic exchanges, has to do with hanging pieces. And it's a distinction between a piece that is hanging and a piece that is unprotected that is kind of, to my mind at least, not a super important distinction to understand the theory of, because what really matters is being able to put it into practice. So the difference is quite simple. Here is a knight on f3. Clearly that is an undefended piece. Note, of course, that I use undefended or unprotected interchangeably. And this bishop on b7 is also quite clearly an undefended piece. Likewise, the rook on d1. However, there is a difference between the rook on d1 and the bishop on b7, which can both be said to be unprotected pieces, and the knight on f3. And the difference is that if it were black to play, the knight on f3 would fall immediately. So it is a hanging piece. So that is the definition that we use for a hanging piece. It's simply a piece that is not being defended and can be taken. We can also say one thing, one more important little detail in the case of hanging pieces. Let's imagine that white was having a bad day and he played the move knight to g5. This would be a very silly move since the pawn on h6 can take the knight. But let's say that black himself is feeling in a very generous mood and plays the move bishop to d5 instead, just completely ignoring the knight, which is an unprotected knight, and it's also a hanging knight. And now white says, oh, damn, my knight is unprotected, so I better defend it, and plays the move h4. Well, clearly here, if you're black, you would be very happy you captured the knight. Sure, you'd lose the pawn, but it's no big deal. A pawn is worth very little relative to a knight. So in this case, can we say that the knight is unprotected? No, we cannot. Can we say that the knight is hanging? Yes, we certainly can. So we can say that a hanging piece can be when it's either not defended, like in the original position, and it can be taken, or when it is defended, but the piece or the pawn that is threatening to capture it can do so very favorably, very profitably. So in this case, it's also a hanging piece. But anyway, that is all we need to know about the theory of it. Let's now take a look at a very nice example. Actually, I'm going to show you guys a game, very, very high level game, where black was a former world champion called Vladimir Kramnik. Some of you will no doubt. Let's start in this position, and here white played the move pawn to e5, and black now played the move knight to d5. We notice that here, if we look at the count on this bishop on e3, well, we can see that it's defended once, but it is, unfortunately for white, attacked twice. So white had to do something about that and drop the bishop back. Now we see that by playing the move bishop to d2, the bishop on d3 is no longer defended by the queen. Therefore, white now has an unprotected bishop on d3, as well as an unprotected pawn on e5. However, neither of these points are being attacked right now, so neither of them are hanging. Black plays the move pawn to d6, and in fact immediately threatens to capture that undefended pawn. White, however, ignores it, plays the move pawn to c4. Now we see that this knight, although certainly protected, is certainly hanging. So the knight goes back. And now here, let's go back to what we learned about counting. Well, strong players, they always are very, very aware of the weak points in a position, especially typical weak points like the pawn on h7. And here we see that the count is one attacker and one defender. So white plays the move queen to c2, which is a clever move, increasing the count on this point. So now this point certainly can be taken. So we can say that the pawn is hanging. The knight goes to g6. Black figures that yes, although he could capture white's hanging pawn on e5, he prefers to defend his hanging pawn on h7. He considers it more important. The knight went to g6. And now a couple of captures here. Knight went to c3. And now we can more or less fast forward a few moves. There was nothing too interesting up to here. The only thing to say is we see that the count is one attacker and one defender. So white may have to be a little bit careful with that bishop. White played the move rook to e4. Black dropped his queen back. White continued to attack the black queen. Black continued to prevent it from being captured. And now we do notice there is a bit of a concern for white because the queen and the rook are both lined up on the same diagonal, the b1 to h7 diagonal, and we see this guy here on c8 can move to f5 and win material. So white dropped the queen to d1. Now let's take a look at the topics of hanging points and undefended points and also just general counting. Let's see how we could apply it here. The first thing to note is the rook on e4. It's being attacked, but as it's being defended, it is not unprotected. However, it's being attacked once, defended only once, so it's a little bit vulnerable. The next point that we can see the queen is aiming at is the pawn on g2, which of course is an important point, and it's reduced in mobility because the king lies behind it. Again, the queen is attacking it and only the king defends it. So that's important to keep in mind because, once again, it could be a vulnerable point. So we have these 2 points that are protected and attacked an equal number of times. Black plays the move bishop to h3, immediately targeting one of the 2 points, g2 and e4, that were a little bit vulnerable, and threatens checkmate. White has no choice but to defend with the move bishop to f3. But notice one thing about this position. Well, in the initial position here, we said that the rook on e4 is a little bit vulnerable because it's attacked once and only defended once, as is the pawn on g2. Black gangs up on the pawn on g2, creates a big threat, and now white plays the move bishop to f3, which is pretty much a forced move. Black now drops the bishop back, but what we can notice about this bishop here on f3 is that by luring the bishop onto f3 from e2, we see that it is now very vulnerable because it's attacked once and defended only once. Whereas in this original position, it's attacked 0 times, while it is being defended 3 times. We'll see why that matters in a second. Bishop went to f3, bishop went to f5 now, and white played the move rook to h4. This, as it turns out, was the decisive mistake. Notice one thing about this rook. It is undefended. What was the better move in this position? In fact, the best move was probably rook to f4. This move would have left the rook defended and would also have given more support to this bishop on f3. And so hopefully you're getting an idea of what I meant at the start of this section, at the start of the topic, when I talked about how it's important to keep your position as solid and as stable as possible. After the move rook to h4, black wins pretty much on the spot because if we see this bishop, it's attacked once, but only defended once. It's easy to think it's defended twice, but the truth is that the pawn on g2 is pinned. So if we could get the queen away from the defense of the bishop, we would have the devastating move knight takes f3 with check. And so that is exactly what black did. He played the move bishop to c2, moving the queen away from the d1 square. And if he goes queen to e2, which white didn't play, black will now drop the bishop back to d3, attacking the queen and also attacking the rook behind the queen. If queen goes to d1, he will capture the rook. The king must take. And now after a move like rook over to the center, bringing that final piece into play, it's game over. Therefore, white didn't actually play this move, but instead went for a completely crazy move, queen takes bishop on c2. Now, of course, if black captures here, black would still be winning, because after the move bishop to e4, this was the idea. Queen takes bishop, bishop takes h7 check, king goes to h8, and bishop f5 check. This is maybe a little bit too fast moving, but don't worry about it. The point I just wanted to show is that after queen to h6, this would have been winning. But the black player, Vladimir Kramnik, one of the world's best, decided that he wasn't even going to give his opponent the illusion of hope. And instead, in this position, started by capturing the bishop on f3 with check. And what is this bishop? It is an unprotected piece that can be taken. Therefore, it is a hanging piece. Any other unprotected pieces in the white position? Yes, the queen is an unprotected piece, and the rook on h4 is also an unprotected piece. And so it's no surprise that black's two winning options are to either capture the highest value piece directly, or, even easier, to take the hanging piece with check. And now, in fact, white resigned, because if king goes to h1, now black could simply capture the queen. Although, even that is not forced, he could also capture the hanging rook. In this case, both of white's high value pieces are hanging. And had he gone for knight takes rook in this position, which was never arrived at, but let's imagine that this had unfolded, we see that the queen is still being attacked, and that originally quite vulnerable point on g2 is also now being attacked. So both queen takes queen and queen takes g2 with mate is being threatened. That means white would have no choice but to exchange queens, and here black would have been up a full rook. But I hope you enjoyed that game. By the way, the white player in that game was, at the time, top 10 player in the world, and currently a top 5 player in the world, the French number 1, Bachir Legrave. So this is really a particularly impressive victory. But I chose the game because I feel it highlights very, very well, in a position like this, for example, the very final position, knight takes bishop, that hanging bishop, costing white the game. The undefended rook becomes a hanging rook as well, and also the queen on c2 is hanging. So the entire white position collapses, and it all started because of this move, rook to h4, not defending the bishop, leaving the rook unprotected, and resulting in this crushing move, bishop to c2, winning on the spot. So I hope you got something out of this game, and indeed the whole section, and I hope that you understand the importance of counting. I've tried to show some simple examples and then work up to even more complicated examples like this very last one amongst top grandmasters. So I hope that it's become clear to you that this is an aspect of chess that will rear its head. This topics of counting, the theme of, unprotected pieces, pieces that are hanging. These areas are part of the backbone of chess play, and if you want to improve your game, then for sure you need to be very, very comfortable with everything that's been covered in this section. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you in another section.